The GFCC, it's a global multi-stakeholder organization. We have members that are universities, corporations, government agencies, and private sector councils, industry chambers, and alike. Combining our members and fellows, we have a footprint in 30 countries. One of the key things in the GFCC agenda is innovation, value creation, how we can build a better and more prosperous future for our societies. In that context, back in 2016, we launched the GFCC Universal Research Leadership Forum that gathers leaders from across the globe. We do that because universities are the growth engines of the knowledge economy. Today, we are here for another one of our Now, Bridge, and Reboot conversations. And we're focusing on universities. So Now, Bridge, and Reboot, decoding the now for universities. We're doing that in partnership with the University of Southampton. And Maria, it's a pleasure to work with you, to have you leading this session. We have speakers coming from different parts of the globe talking decoding the now research. How are research models changing? How will research priorities change as we eventually emerge from the pandemic? We invite you all to be part of this conversation. We are very proud to have university members like OIST in Japan, the University of California, San Diego, and the University of Southampton. I invite you all to join the conversation. We have the chat function that will be open for you to share your questions. And throughout the session, we will also have a series of polls to get your insights and inputs. As I said, this is done in partnership with the University of Southampton. Maria Norton will lead us through this conversation. Maria, over to you. It's a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you to the GFCC for hosting us. And I'm Maria, I'm your moderator today. We're here to debate and decode the now in research. Our intention is to provide the space to think through and articulate the future we want in higher education. Topics up for discussion today include changing our professional practices and our mindsets, creating more equitable and sustainable models. And to start off, we've got a poll. So the first thing we'd like to do is actually invite you, the audience, to respond to this poll. It's the first one of 3 that you'll see today. It's a glossary. Please, we ask you to indicate which of these concepts you're least familiar with. So please click on your screen for the concept or concepts you are least familiar with. And as you start to vote, we should start to see some results. We'll give you a few more seconds. And hopefully, Vanessa, do we have any results? Wow, okay, there's definitely one concept that we're going to be touching on quite a few times today. We'll be mindful of that and we'll explain it as we go along. But very interesting, thank you. Thank you for that. So the structure for today, we're going to have a few broad questions to warm up our conversation. The key part for us, though, is this community Q&A. So that's where we invite your input. As Roberto said, please, the chat box is there for you to pose your questions, share your thoughts on what we're discussing. And as we reach our conclusions, again, we'll turn to you, the audience, to provide us with your thoughts, and we'll invite your opinions as we come to a close. So, first of all, my first prompt as I introduce the panelists is, would you tell us something about the signs for the way out of the crisis? So we don't need the screen, Vanessa. Thank you. Yeah, if we go back to the normal view. I'd like to call on Paul Roben, Associate Vice Chancellor from the Office of Innovation and Commercialization at the University of California, San Diego, with the prompt. Paul, would you like to tell us something about the signs for the way out of the crisis, please?
Sure. Thank you, Maria, and thank you for all your hard work in pulling this together as well, and to the GFCC for hosting us. You know, one thing that I think has been apparent throughout this pandemic crisis is the incredible ability of people to work together across disciplines that haven't previously worked necessarily together. You know, when this pandemic hit all over the world, but I speak from San Diego experience, people just downed tools. They said, okay, you know, how can I bring my expertise and the resources that I have to bear to work with people across the spectrum to develop solutions to this pandemic? And we have seen this sort of transdisciplinarity really emerge and develop solutions across the board here for the COVID crisis, everything from ventilators to diagnostics, testing, therapeutics, et cetera, right? And I think you can really, this is really evident in the astounding speed at which globally we have not just developed vaccines for this, but we've developed a whole new class of vaccines for this, which I think is going to change the way that we approach pandemics in the future. So that for me is the opportunity that has come out of this pandemic.
Absolutely. There are silver linings, I think, that you've described a few of them there. And the speed, that 10-month period that we've been going through this pandemic, we've actually come on 10 years in how we work and the technologies that we use.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce David James, who is the Senior Advisor to the President for Institutional Development at the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology Graduate University. David, welcome. Can you tell us something? Hey, can you tell us something about the signs, the way out of the crisis, please?
Sure, Maria, and just as Paul did, I also want to express my deep appreciation to you and to the GFCC for hosting this. You know, I think there are two thoughts running through my head in regard to signs of moving out of this crisis. One is the way that we've responded to it already, right? The sort of adaptation, and this goes to some of the points that Paul made. I think the fact that universities, industry, many other places have really rapidly adapted, you know, shows us a path forward, even if the overall situation doesn't change as rapidly as we want. But I'm hoping, as it was just mentioned, that the vaccines do come and that, you know, international travel will resume. And that's very important for us as a kind of way out of this, because the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology is, you know, on an island that is difficult to get to. In fact, right now, given the travel ban in Japan, we have a lot of students and faculty that are supposed to be there but can't be there. So I think, you know, looking out toward the fall, we're hoping that travel will resume and that these people can get there. I think looking further out, you know, past this year into 2022 and beyond, I hope, and we'll get into this later in the discussion, I hope that we don't just return to the way things were in the past. I hope that there are lessons, the kind of adaptations that we've learned through this and other lessons that we take with us and help use that to kind of shape a new future.
Absolutely. Are we really going to go back to business as usual, or can we really take the learning and make that change? Okay. Well, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Rachel Mills from the University of Southampton, Dean of the Faculty of Environmental and Life Sciences and the university's Sustainability Champion. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you, Maria. And again, I'm really pleased to be here. It's great to find out what GFCC does, and it's great to be part of this discussion. So thank you for inviting me. So as Maria said, I'm the university's sustainability champion, and I've spent the last 10 months doing something slightly different, that during this pandemic, not only surviving and getting through it, I've also helped develop the university's new sustainability strategy. That's really ambitious. And the reason why we decided to develop this and invest in this during a pandemic is because it's a massive opportunity. You know, here in Britain, we're in full lockdown again. Everybody's working from home. I'm in my front room for the 10th month, and we're all working differently. There's got to be ways that we can use some of this learning from the pandemic to come out of this in a new way and in a new sustainable way. Now, I think maybe Okinawa is somewhere ahead of us in terms of that thinking, and we'll hear about that later on. But certainly in the UK, the university sector is very much wedded to the sort of model where we have historical buildings, where people have individual offices, and a lot of PIs are working in their own laboratories in isolation. And it's served us very well, this model. I think now is the chance for us to bounce back in a very new way of working. And that new way of working is going to be more collaborative. It's certainly going to be more sustainable. And we're going to think of new ways of collaborating globally, because we don't want to stop doing that, but we must do it with a smaller carbon footprint. Working in our university buildings, but we've got to do it with a smaller carbon footprint, because we cannot carry on working the way we have been and meet all of the ambitions we have to stay within a couple of degrees centigrade warming. And we'll talk about that later on. So that's what I've been doing. And I think it's a massive opportunity, an opportunity of a lifetime, I think, to really change the way we operate.
I agree totally. We need to frame this pandemic pause for thought as an opportunity to change how we do things for a more sustainable way of life. That's exactly where we're at. So let's take on a couple more broad areas. And now I'd like to consider the challenges we've faced these past 10 months around research, whether that's lab-based or field work, experimental work. I want to hear about how your researchers have adapted to the pandemic-related restrictions. I'd like to bring Paul in on this first, and then David.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the main challenge that we faced across the university is that we can't be there, right? So only about 25% of people could be on campus at any given point in time, as per the regulations of the state and the county and so on. So that poses a challenge, but again, out of adversity was opportunity, and the researchers adapted immediately to that, and effectively broke down the walls of the laboratory. So one example of that was this application that they developed called Earth 2.0, and what that really did was it widened the scope of people who could contribute to the research. So people could pose research questions on this thing. We could bring people from anywhere in the world, whether it be academia or industry or even the public in general, and leverage their brain power and contributions and perspectives to solving the problems and developing the solutions that the research was focusing on. And it's been tremendously successful, and has led to the development of many disruptive applications and solutions. This is all focused on the pandemic at this point in time, but to echo what my other panelists have said, I really hope that this is sustained. I hope that it outlasts the pandemic, as it were, and that it actually changes the approach to research, and that we're sort of much more democratic and inclusive in how we do our research. And I think that's going to depend to some extent on the technologies that develop in order to facilitate this type of communication, looking at VR and AR and all these types of things, and we'll see how that works in the future. But certainly my hope and my expectation is that I think it's forever changed research and increase this engagement and interactivity that we have with others in conducting our research.
Mm-hmm. And Earth 2.0, it sounds a bit like citizen science.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's not just totally throw open the doors and see what happens. There's a curated and validation aspect to it. But certainly, yes, it is. It does have an element of citizen science to it.
Wow. Okay, thank you. And David, what about with OIST?
Sure. Yeah, I think, a common theme that we're seeing here is that in this crisis, there's opportunity. There's pluses and minuses. So an obvious and very similar to what Paul's facing at UC San Diego challenge is, the ability to get into the labs. So at OIST, this is a graduate university. All the students are PhD students. Labs are critical to their research, and the use of the equipment is absolutely critical. The good news is that until recently, COVID cases in Okinawa and Japan have been relatively low, and it's really allowed the university to stay open, and very strict PCR testing has allowed most of the research to continue. But that's a deep challenge. But the opportunities are, I think, resonate with what Paul was saying. I think this crisis has kind of broken down three barriers for us. One is a barrier, or maybe it wasn't a barrier per se, but something we didn't pursue, which is we've been able to foster very deep ties with the local community. And it's, through a kind of shift in the research priority. A lot of faculty at OIST and students have shifted research a bit to work on COVID-19 related issues that are important to the community. That's built a very nice tie and a deep tie with the local community. Then the second sort of bridge is with the rest of Japan. We've done a lot of interesting webinars with partners and other universities throughout Japan and globally. And so I think it opened up a whole array of discussions and opportunities. So even though we were isolated and separated in some way, we were able to sort of reassemble online in new ways.
Absolutely. So there are new groupings that we see in this act of co-creation that we've been pushed into, perhaps. So what does this mean about rethinking the rules of engagement? Rachel, can I bring you in here? So, for example, how do we do conferences, for example?
So I won't go back. Southampton's been dealing with a lot of the same issues and has had much worse cases than certainly in Japan in terms of impact on our ability to be open. And so we've had to rethink the global conference. We've all seen that, because we're all in global communities that have had to have very quickly moved to online conference participation. And I've really enjoyed that. So from my privilege of a sort of senior scientist in the field, I've loved the fact I haven't had to do long haul flights, have jet lag, spend long periods of time away from my home. And I have been able to sort of drop in and hear the most fantastic presentations. And because I guess I'm well networked, I guess people at our stage in our career have been pretty privileged and have enjoyed it. But what I've learned is that when I talk to our early career researchers and our PhD students and the people that are just starting out on their careers, is they're not nearly as satisfied with this way of working. And their challenge back to me is, you benefited from all of this. I want a bit of it myself. I want to be on that long haul flight. I'm young and it doesn't affect me. I don't get jet lag. And I think what we've got to do is to realize that the future is going to be a blend of this, that we need to, the conference of the future is more accessible if people can attend remotely. I've seen lots more accessibility. I've seen lots more participation in discussion from many varied voices. We're probably seeing this in the chat today, that we hear different voices in discussion when it's operating remotely. But people need to be there, and people need to be there face to face as well. Now, when you blend it, you've got a different problem, because of course the people in the room have got a different experience than the people that are coming in remotely, and somehow you've got to make that work. But I'm hoping that the tech people out there can find some really clever solutions for this, where you can have some sort of avatar that's present, that is having a drink with the people in the bar, etc. And we have to reimagine the future, but it's gonna be different for sure. And that's a good thing, because I think it will be more equitable and it will be more sustainable. And I think we just need to bring everybody with us.
That's it. And there is that serendipity gap. So by not having those conversations in the bar, the networking, we're missing out on that. And that, that spark, we need that for innovation as well. I don't know, Paul, do you want to say anything there, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the jury is out on where this is going to end up, I think, at the end of the day. And I think what Rachel said is absolutely true. We're going to get to some sort of blend of in-person and technology. The technology is not there yet. You know, being totally on Zoom, we do lose something. There is this loss of empathy. There's a loss of personal interaction. And it does affect the serendipity gap, as you also pointed out, particularly in conference type settings. But we are, experimenting with, I got myself an Oculus for Christmas, specifically for work. We are experimenting with these technologies. I mean, there are ways you can be in the rooms and even develop prototypes and, develop solutions together and so on. They're not there yet, but I have no doubt that if we were to do this again 10 years from now, we'd look back and say, hey, look, now we can do this. You know, we were developing molecules to inhibit, as a therapeutics kind of stuff. And we had people in Paris, Tokyo, and San Diego all doing it, in a room together. So it's pretty exciting what's going to get there. But I'm going to show you how old I am now and say, I don't think we're ever going to completely get rid of the need for personal interaction. You know, people are people. And I think there's always going to be a need for some element of looking at each other in the eye in the same room.
Yeah. Yeah. And David, I think you've had very interesting experiences at OIST with the VIP sessions.
Right. Well, we've been experimenting, as everyone here has, with how to keep some bit of serendipity alive. And we started a whole series of webinars, which on one hand provided an interesting opportunity, which wouldn't have existed if we didn't have this kind of technology. I mean, over a course of a year, just like GFCC, we held a whole array of webinars and engaged thousands of people, which I can't imagine how much travel that would have taken, if we had tried to do it in person. But you miss out on those sort of side conversations. And so to emulate that, what we did was hold sort of broad webinars with large audiences, but then afterwards, we held some small group, max 25 people, Zoom meeting VIP sessions that were really open and free-flowing conversations. And it's interesting. I mean, it's not the same. I agree with Paul. There's nothing to replace physical meeting, but there was a lot of interesting things that came out that were unexpected. And I think another interesting thing is, during this time when we've all been separated, to think about, have we made new friends, new contacts? Is that possible? And I just think, this panel is sort of an experiment, right? We've all just recently met, but I think just through this process, we probably feel comfortable enough to follow up with each other, and the relationship could deepen. And so it's interesting sort of times, right?
Yeah. Okay. And I wonder, I think there's been talk of the gaps. So apart from the serendipity gap, there are also gaps. For example, there's the good old policy gap between scientists and government. There's also possibly the gap between industry, university and industry. And I'd like to go down that path now. We've got our second poll ready for the audience. I believe Vanessa is going to pop poll 2 on your screen. And this is asking you to vote for what you think we can do at universities to align more with industry. There is, of course, the option at the bottom, in case we haven't quite captured what you think we should do. So if you do choose the other option, do please write what that means for you in the chat. So essentially, we'd like you to vote for one or more of these options. What can help us bridge the gap between university and industry? And we'll give you a few more seconds to vote. And then I think Vanessa has some results to share with us. 5 seconds more, good idea. Okay, yeah, it's a bit more to read on this poll. You'll be glad to know the final poll is very straightforward. All right. Again, there's a clear winner. Okay, super. New models. Well, indeed, I think we can definitely talk about that. Thank you. And I think I'd like to invite Roberto to talk to us about what he sees that's been going on in industry and what can we learn at university from that, please.
Thank you, Maria. I think that what really calls for my attention here, it's really about the differences or the new things that will come out of the situation and how those new solutions and models will help everybody, all sectors, societies to create value. And there are 3 things that I want to quickly highlight here. One, it's really about the differences between industry and academia. When we had one of the University Research Leadership Forum meetings in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and we had industry, research, business leaders getting together, we published a report that was called Speed and Leadership. And the notion or the key concept for that was that industry is faster than academia to address complex problems that cut across disciplines. So this one thing, those differences, how do you see that? I think that Paul mentioned this multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary efforts that universities are doing. What could we learn now from the industry? I think that industry has been probably faster in reacting in manufacturing and in research or at a certain point. So what are the differences? How can we maybe build speed by design in university models learning from the industry? The second point that also is related to models, and David highlighted that, we have new models to develop vaccines. This is a global benchmark. We had never done that before in so fast as we did now. So how new research and innovation methods could be systematized and how could we build from there? But also what maybe new models for universities will emerge to work with industry to engage. I just recalled a new company that was started up in Spain, in the United States, that's creating this virtual network of labs. It can be in some way far-fetched, but imagine that you can start up a new university without a lab, but signing up for their virtual labs in the future. Is that crazy or not? Are new models that are coming up? And finally, I think for sure, Rachel commented that about sustainability. What are the new topics? And how could we really build momentum and change not just research profiles, but the profiles in terms of the topics that the university will engage with the industry and create a new value. So those are like the differences and the new things that come to my mind. We've been hearing about that from GFCC members that are in the policy and business spaces. So I thought it would make sense to share with all of you.
Thank you, Roberto. Whistle stop tour, thanks. Of many, many elements that we need to consider. And also in the chat, I noticed, thank you to Walid Al-Somali for your suggestion that we also need a strategic operating model with clear roles and accountabilities. Well, let's take this on the lines of sustainability first. As you say, there are differences between how businesses do things and how universities do things. If we run with sustainability, Rachel, what would you contribute here, please?
Well, let's start with using our space. I've already sort of alluded to this in that this is top of my list at the moment and I love the idea of the virtual labs. I really love that. So we need to move very fast because of the climate crisis imperative. We need to move very fast towards what we call net zero. And to get to net zero, we're going to have to use our space really differently. We're going to have a different amount of space, and it's got to be much, much more sustainable in terms of the carbon emissions it produces, whether it's heating or the power supply for all of this fantastic technology, or even our cloud-based IT solutions, that they all have carbon emissions associated with them. And we need to think much more cleverly about how we do this collaboratively. We don't all need to replicate. And as I said already earlier, each PI does not need their own space. We can use space in a collaborative way. We can collaborate internationally. We could collaborate between industry and between academia. We could think in completely different ways. But let's go further than that. We're talking very much about technological solutions here. One of the gaps I perceive has been a real blocker to us being able to respond to the COVID pandemic is the gap between STEM technology and social science and society. We can't even communicate across that gap. We find that ability, we speak different languages. We find that implementation of policy. So let's say we get the technology solution into policy. What about implementing that policy in society in a coherent way? So we've got to find space for that sort of collaboration as well. So it's not just technology. It's around just getting our social scientists and our engineers together so they can even communicate with each other.
Absolutely. So to really foster interdisciplinary working, we need a common language, for sure. And then in terms of our estate, we need to really work on the utilization, the value extraction, which I think industry has got going much better. But I know OIST is an excellent example, I believe, of really making the most of the estate.
Yeah, thank you for that, Maria. And just to build on what Rachel said, and also what Roberto, some of the very interesting points and ideas he brought about. OIST is young, 10 years old, and that has some great advantages, and some disadvantages. But one really great advantage is it was designed in many ways to be a model to spark change in the way research is being done, especially in Japan, but perhaps beyond. And one of the key points, which resonates exactly with what Rachel said, is shared equipment. So instead of each PI having an office next to a lab with their own equipment that has, maybe a 20% utilization rate, common equipment that everyone can share. And then beyond that, we've started really partnering with universities in other parts of Japan and allowing them to use our equipment, because we have equipment, certain kinds of microscopes and other scientific equipment that other universities don't have. And we really want to give them access to that. So that kind of plays into Roberto's part of, idea about ways to share space and have it, perhaps spread out. I just want to echo, and maybe we can get into it later if there's time, but I think Rachel's point, and Maria, you brought it out earlier too, this gap between policy and science. And I know Paul's quite interested in, sort of the larger gap between just science and the public at large. These are really, really critical issues that I think all of our institutions have to tackle. And again, maybe it's something we can talk about in more depth later.
Paul, would you like to take that on?
Great. Yeah, I mean, we could talk all day about this one question. I mean, there's so much to tackle in this. What can we learn as academic institutions from industry? I mean, so much. I think Rachel and David have already said this, but industry attacks things in a much more multifunctional kind of a way. It brings a number of different perspectives and disciplines together to develop solutions. Whereas academia tends to break things down to its component parts and then really dig deep into those, individual components. I think we can learn a lot from how industry does it in terms of being much more transdisciplinary and multifunctional. And with that comes sustainability and resource sharing and all of the other things that the other panelists have already talked about. I think something else that we can learn from industry is, they're there to create value, right, for their shareholders. And so they have to be very connected to who the customer is. So they're always keeping an eye out on, what is it that the customer wants. And I think, even in academic research, that's something that a lesson that we can take on as well. How is our research ultimately going to be applied? And, how are people going to use it and so on. And again, that to echo what Rachel says, that means you have to bring the social sciences and the arts and other people that we have on our campus, right? But that the STEM people don't normally talk to really develop something that people want to use. Otherwise, engineers will develop widgets all day and nobody will use them. So, this whole engagement piece is really important. But at the same time, I think we need to do that with some element of caution, because we're not industry. We're here to create and disseminate knowledge. And there's many different ways to do that. So we all need to understand our roles within this greater marketplace, and do what we're really good at. Because if we were to take away the fundamental research piece, then we'd be dead in the water 10 years and 20 years down the line, because we're keeping, our eye on that kind of a time scale as well. So we have to find the right balance. And the last comment I make, to echo what David said, policy is always the slowest thing. It usually takes years to catch up on everything else. But I think that one thing that both academia and industry need to take more responsibility for is the policy piece, in building awareness and education in the public, just amongst the public at large, about the value and the benefit of science, and how it benefits people. We can see, particularly in the US, at the moment, how not taking on that responsibility has led to difficulties, among certain parts of the public. And that's our fault in many ways. It's our responsibility to help our politicians and to act in collaboration with them to raise awareness and really demonstrate the value of science and research.
Mm-hmm. And there is the community piece there, as you're saying. So, one of our missions, the civic duty of the university. So that brings us, I think, to let's go a bit further now to talk about outreach into the community. We do have a slide to accompany that. So I don't know if Vanessa's got this slide available, slide 2, although I think it says 4 on the page. Sorry, Vanessa. If we have that slide, these are a few questions that we'd received. Yeah, so if you go to the next page, outreach into the community, exactly. A couple of questions just to sort of spark off the conversation. I'd like to bring David in, because I understand that OIST has got a very interesting model for outreach into the community.
Yeah, thank you. There's two aspects of outreach maybe that are interesting and relevant to talk about here. One is perhaps the immediate short term related to the COVID situation, which I alluded to earlier. OIST is an international institution. 80% of the students are from outside of Japan, but we're in Okinawa, a very unique kind of social setting. And during this particular time, we really quickly started reaching out to hospitals, to the prefectural government, to the medical community, other places, to use the knowledge that we had and the kind of expertise we had to partner with those local institutions to try to have an impact. And some of those things were, things that many universities were doing, from, providing sterilization kits and, doing modeling of the COVID-19, printing face shields, but then there were other types of things we were doing as well. But I think, to go back to a bit of the last conversation, the other piece of outreach that is very important and embedded into the mission of OIST is outreach to the K through 12 community, educational outreach, really trying to help boost scientific literacy in Okinawa and beyond. And also trying to foster pathways for young people to be excited about and have the competency to continue with their education in these fields. So both of those areas are things we're engaged in, and I think are really critical.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, David, for that. I think this brings us to our third theme, because I think it's going to be helpful if you look at the common operating picture. So now, what commonalities can we share about our learning? Vanessa, do you have the third slide? So the next slide. Perfect. Again, a range of questions that we've received before. We welcome more questions. I see it's very active in the Q&A. Great. Again, these are just a guideline. So maybe we can lose the slide as we get into the discussion. We know that universities are labs of social change and paradoxically highly resistant to change, but we've seen things shift during the pandemic. What does this mean for our work? I wonder if Paul or David would want to comment on this common operating picture. Paul?
Yeah, so, you know, one thing that I think what David was just saying is this community outreach is really, really important at all levels. We you know, we have to develop a way of demonstrating what it is we do. I mean, scientists, because of their enthusiasm and deep knowledge about stuff, are usually really bad at talking to the public. Because, you know, they're so technical and so you know, in depth in discussing what it is they're doing. So one thing that I think we should be looking at is training all of our scientists how to communicate at different levels to different different audiences. So that's something that we're certainly looking at, or that we are doing across our campus, and giving our scientists the opportunity to get out into the community, whether it's to go to the K through 12, you know, the high schools and earlier, and really get people interested and excited about science. So that's something that I think is critical, that we're much more engaged with the community. I think, you know, in research, I think it goes a lot further than that. The community has to be part of our research, you know, in helping us to actually do our research. And I think we've seen a lot of that, and the opportunities that have arisen by forcing a lot of us to sit at home, as I am now, you know, and not be in the hallowed halls of the university, has actually accelerated that process, I think, of really embedding the community within how we do our research, and for that matter, how we do education, you know, and how we prepare our students for the real world, as it were, after life in the university. So I think there's a lot of stuff that has changed. The rate of change has accelerated tremendously over this pandemic. And I really hope that a lot of it is here to stay, because the only way that universities are sustainable is if the community and the public at large see the value of the university. You know, if they're seen as expensive ways to train elite students, that's not a sustainable model, right? We have to be, the value of the whole university system has to be understood and appreciated by the public at large. And for that, the research approach, the education approach, everything, I think, is going to change. Whereas, you know, we're certainly not going to be the same 30 years from now as we are now.
There's a challenge.
Maria, if I may quickly interrupt, just want to call everybody the attention to some of the questions that
I know there's some amazing questions.
On the chat. Amazing questions that are exactly about what Paul and Dave mentioned about engagement and the tools to do that. So just want to call attention of all of us to those amazing questions.
Can I come in there? So I mean, I'm looking at Nefele's question around credit for this. I've just come off a faculty forum in the University of Southampton, and a lot of the early career researchers are really concerned about essentially their career progression as we come out of this pandemic. How do they get credit in terms of their career progression for this citizen science activity, this outreach activity, their civic agenda activity, their impact activity that isn't reflected in their H indices or their citation rates or their Nature paper publications? And we, as the leaders, have to change the way we measure success and measure giving and how we give credit. And what I assured all of my staff this afternoon is that we'd find a way of doing this, and we'd find a way of doing it fast, that we cannot go back to our standard way of monitoring, tenure applications in the US or promotion applications in the UK, because it's not in the slightest bit equitable post-pandemic. There's lots of evidence to show that different populations have been differently affected by this. And we've got to move fast to find a new way of measuring success that will allow people to thrive. And I think that will provide the solution, because if the next generation of academia that comes through are measured in a different way, I think we will see a different type of behavior and a different type of collaboration and a different type of focus on the priorities.
I'm really glad that somebody brought that up, because it's absolutely crucial within a university setting. People will do what they're rewarded to do. And if they're not recognized and rewarded to do these types of activities, they're not going to do them in any setting. So it's absolutely crucial that, yes, we measure things differently. We recognize activities that we haven't recognized before in a much broader sense across broader disciplines. Somebody in political science could develop a policy which is taken up by local government and actually implemented. That should be recognized. So there's the different activities that we measure needs to be far broader, and then credit needs to be given to everybody for that. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Maybe I can also flag what James Metzen from the University of Auckland has put in the chat. So also kudos to James for being with us, because it must be like 4 a.m. or something in New Zealand, 5 a.m. Anyway, welcome. So really, I value the fact that he's pointing out, hey, watch out, we're going back to normal. So we're going to lose this imperative for change and innovation. So really, the time is now, that window is closing. So, okay, something to be mindful of.
Absolutely.
I don't know
and of course, New Zealand have got it sorted, haven't they? So we're very jealous of New Zealand. So, I think we have a bit longer in the UK.
Yeah, right. We'll pass that one. David, I don't know if you have something you want to say, or is it time for our third and final poll? Because I think this does lead us nicely to our final poll, which will bring us to our conclusions. So poll number 3, as promised, is hopefully straightforward. Vanessa, there we are. Cast your votes. You have 3 options, but as you know, that last option really isn't an option, but over to you. What will we be like in 10 years from now? Are we really going to slip back? Are we going to race ahead and be totally different? Or please cast your votes. We want to see results, because this will show us how much more work we've got to do or not in the remaining 10 minutes. Vanessa, what results have we got, please? Okay. So almost 2/3 are there with us. We're on that way, on that path to change for the better. What does that mean? From your experience, what do you see on the horizon? Rachel, can you go for telling us 2030? What do you see, please?
Well, one of the things we've committed to in Southampton is to be net zero by 2030. So it's a date that's sort of, embellished on my heart. And I think essentially I'm assuming we're going to be through this pandemic by then, and hopefully no more pandemics will have come. Let's park that. And I think we'll be well on our way, as in the UK and globally we're going to have to be, to meeting those net zero ambitions. Because if we're not, the temperature is going to have gone up rather high. So we'll have seen 1.5, 2 degrees C, maybe 3 degrees C warming if we don't get on with it in the next 10 years. So we're going to be working differently. To meet that ambition, we're going to have to work differently to cut carbon emissions out of our daily lives, out of our activity, and out of our research. We haven't got all the solutions yet, so they're emerging fast. We can't afford some of the solutions right now, but we've got a lot of work to do in the next decade to meet that ambition.
Yes. Paul? Your view.
I think a lot is going to change. I think of it in two buckets. Universities are there for education and for research, right? I think education is going to look entirely different. Our students are already demanding a different way of being educated. And we need to, I think universities are very good at imparting the technical skills for particular jobs to students. What they're not very good at is teaching students how to get on in the world. How to be creative and how to be analytical and how to work in team environments and, how to be leaders and all that kind of stuff. I think we're going to see an awful lot more of that embedded into the academic curriculums. I think it's going to be much more experience driven. I think it'll be more modular. I think it'll be far more multifunctional. And you're going to get a lot more lifelong learning.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's going to be huge changes. And when did you say 2030? I think we'll be in process at that point amongst the four-year universities. I think research is going to be more democratic in terms of by that I mean the democratization of research. So bringing in far more perspectives, people from outside the four walls of the lab. I don't think the four walls of the lab will matter as much. I think it'll be a lot more sustainable with a lot more research sharing, brain power sharing. We're learning a lot through this pandemic. Again, it's the opportunity out of the crisis on how to do that and the technologies that are needed to do that. So I think that'll be, a positive change for research. And I think it'll be more solution oriented than it traditionally has been, with more of an eye on sort of the end game, if you like, which will take an integration of the value chain of academia to industry to the public at large, without losing the identity of the research university, which is extremely important.
Yeah. And I don't know if I can actually now go back to something you were saying earlier, Paul, which is really about how we're measuring an academic's outputs. And that came out in the conversation, I think, also with Rachel, perhaps, and David, and bring in something that was mentioned in the chat somewhat earlier about our early career researchers and what are we doing. They've got it really tough right now. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of hope as well, I think, from the sort of civic duty, the community outreach that's going on. Can we weave all of that just to sort of give mention for early career researchers and how things are going to be, they're going to be in a much better world?
Well, early career researchers are very ambitious to have an impact, right? They're looking beyond kind of the startup package. You come to the university, you set up your lab, and you go and get grants and publish papers. They and I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all, but they're looking broader than that now in terms of what's the impact of this going to be. And before they're coming to our university at all now, they're talking to people like myself, which they wouldn't have done before. How do you help us start companies? How do you help us protect our IP? How do you help us make those connections to industry? And if they feel that there isn't a good framework within the university to do that, they're not coming. So it's an interesting change. And with that, then we have to figure out how to give them credit and recognize all of those activities. There's a national thing here in the States called PTIE, P-T-I-E, which has developed a framework for a broader set of metrics and recognition and promotion and tenure and so on, which I think is a very positive change. And I'd love to see that implemented in the next couple of years nationally. I think that would be a good step forward.
Okay, so different metrics.
Yeah.
David?
To build on that and thinking about your question about what will universities or the world be like in 2030. It's always risky to think about the future, but it's far enough away that everyone will forget what we said. But I think about that in a couple ways. One is, what would I like to happen versus what might, and then I also think about the students at OIST. And to Paul's point, many of the students that I have met and gotten to know at OIST are very interested in starting their own companies and they have a kind of social purpose behind that. There's one student who is originally from Pakistan who grew up in a house without electricity and is working now on very cutting edge solar cells and wants to start a company to bring electricity to rural communities. I've met a number of students with that kind of social mission and entrepreneurial spirit, which I think, gives me a lot of hope and excitement about the future. But a couple thoughts, run through my head about positive and negative thoughts, I guess, about what the future might hold. On the positive side, I hope, as I said at the outset, that some of the lessons that we've learned through this pandemic will stay with us. The ability to connect rapidly through technology, the ability to sort of be flexible and adapt, that is fabulous. I think some of the things we've talked about here, the gaps between policy and the social sciences and science, I hope we can overcome some of those. But some of the concerns I have are, that we see a trend in the United States of small liberal arts colleges closing and people sometimes looking at, certain disciplines as not being profitable or relevant to, your job after college. And I worry about that. There's a great book, which I'll just end with this by saying that E.O. Wilson, who's an amazing biologist, wrote a book that I read last summer called The Meaning of Human Existence. And in that book, he weaves together some of the absolute best of the humanities and social sciences and the most cutting edge science. And it just shows you that you need all of these disciplines to really try to make sense of this world. And I hope that in 2030, we see a world where there's a lot of connections between disciplines built, but I also have a worry that maybe that won't be the case.
Okay, so a word of warning, let's say, but I think we're already starting to see plenty of interdisciplinarity happening by virtue of what we've all gone through the past 10 months. So I think it's time for our final words. I'd like to invite our panelists to give their closing comments on the future role of our research-intensive universities. David, if you'd like to pick up from what you've just been saying there, and then I'll ask Rachel and Paul.
Sure, just thank you for having me on the panel. I think this is great, and I feel as though we have many issues we could continue to cover and talk about. I would just like to say that I think universities, as has been pointed out by the other panelists here, really have a mission beyond the research taking place on campus. I think, we really have a mission to knock down the sort of borders or walls, or however you want to think about it, to work with the local community, the national community, the global community, and really create some new engagement. So I hope that's something we take from some of the challenges we've seen and also some of the adaptations and experiments we've seen. That's my final thoughts.
Thank you. Rachel?
So I think David has made me think about something in a new way, which is, I think our students tend to come into the university as either sort of passionate about sustainability, passionate about social justice, or passionate about being an entrepreneur. And they're sort of siloed in that way. They either want to make money or save the planet. And I think our job and the future of universities, working with industry, working across these divides, is to find that sort of the nexus between those three things, where you can be an entrepreneur that delivers social justice in a sustainable way. And that has to be the future, that we break down that divide. And I hadn't really thought about that before until you were talking, David. So thank you.
Sure.
That's it. It's about the identity and breaking down these identities. We can have multiple identities. Paul, what are your last words today, please?
I mean, the mission of a university, and particularly a public university like we are, is to improve the quality of life for the people in our community and to drive social and economic prosperity for them through workforce creation and talent and technology and so on. I don't think social and economic are mutually exclusive. And I think, as Rachel said, we're finding ways to ensure that we are promoting both at the same time. I think as horrible as this pandemic has been and continues to be, unfortunately, at least where I live, I think we've learned a lot from it. And I think we're going to come out the back end of this better than we went in. And I think it's only going to improve and accelerate our ability to improve the quality of life for the people in our communities, which is what we're here to do.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'd like to hand back to Roberto.
Maria, thank you so much for leading us through this amazing conversation. I have a few remarks here just from a GFCC perspective to close this. One is that at this critical juncture, we must elevate our voices. Knowledge matters, research matters, science matters, innovation matters. It was a privilege to have you talking about that here today. And thanks for highlighting, Rachel, that we can make the world a better place and make money at the same time. That's a trade-off that needs to be broken. The second thing is we'll continue this. On February the 4th, we'll have another online conversation coming up, talking more about innovation ecosystems. So please stay tuned. Check our conversations.dgfcc.org website for updates. We're also continuing this through a series of discussion papers that GFCC University leaders like Professor Jean Madsen, very early for you, as Maria said, Jean, so thank you so much for being here. We'll be releasing those discussion papers in February, and around then organizing another round of conversations. Third comment also about logistics from the GFCC standpoint. This session will be available afterwards at YouTube. So it was recorded, it will be available. So please check it out, share the content with your colleagues. And finally, for those who want to engage with the GFCC, I invite all of you to do so. In addition to our open online conversations, we have monthly calls with our members. We always have content being shared. We had Professor Peter Smith here today with us. A week ago, he was presenting about quantum computing. In the next GFCC monthly meeting for our members and fellows, we'll have a presentation about the future of the innovation in the United States. That's a very timely topic considering the change in the administration in the United States. One of our distinguished fellows, Rick Parker, who's here also today, will present about the hydrogen economy coming up. So lots of things coming up in the GFCC. If you want to know more, please get in touch. And finally, I think one of the things that you mentioned when you started this, Maria, was about a serendipity gap. And the least known theme that was highlighted in the first survey. And that reminds me of the conversation that I had with Peter Smith here, that this is really about the encounters, the meetings, the bumps that we're not having with friends at a coffee shop and other places that could lead us to new ideas, to innovation in the future. Yeah. But it's also great to know that even if I have never met you in person, Maria, we were able to bond, to put this together with you. In spite of the challenges, there are bridges that we can build, there are connections that we can make, there are new things that we can develop and create together. So thank you so much for you, Maria, the University of Southampton, Paul, David, Rachel, and all of you who have joined us today for this amazing session. We'll be back.
Thank you very much. See you in the virtual bar for a caipirinha.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone.